In 1915, a Polish scholar named Bronislaw Malinowski landed on a tiny island off the coast of New Guinea. He had come as an anthropologist, a scientist who studies the origins and behavior of humankind, come to investigate the lifestyle, customs, and beliefs of the people who lived there. The methods he would develop to conduct his investigation would change anthropology forever.
Malinowski was the person who invented the modern fieldwork system in anthropology. He was the person who really took anthropology out of the libraries, out of the universities, and put it, as they say, into the field.
It was a whole new way of looking at culture. It was scientific, it seemed terribly modern, it was terribly exciting. Overnight, Malinowski became a celebrity.
For 20 years, Malinowski used his celebrity status to take anthropology in new directions and to transform himself into the reigning authority in the field.
He made this his project in life to revolutionize social anthropology, as he'd now called it.
A lot of people become very excited by him, very attracted by his way of doing things, and began to share his belief that he is indeed a great man.
In Britain, he reigned supreme, almost like a sort of a god professor.
Imagine yourself suddenly set down, surrounded by all your gear, alone on a tropical beach close to a native village, while the launch that has brought you sails out of sight.
With these words, anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski invited readers of his 1922 book, Argonauts of the Western Pacific, to join him on a unique journey. A journey to the far side of the globe, into a corner of the world few scientists had ever studied, the Trobriand Islands. Films taken decades later record the unusual culture Malinowski found there.
Anthropologically, they were interesting, partly because of this rather unusual sort of cast of their culture, and in having an extraordinary trading system. They also were notorious at that time for having this remarkably free sex life. There was no restrictions on premarital sex, for instance, and they were already sort of known jocularly as the Islands of Love.
But were these and other stories travelers told about the Trobriand people true? Malinowski had come to the islands to find out. He wasn't the first to try. One of his own professors had spent a week in the Trobriands, but except for a few guided tours of local villages, he had spent most of his time interviewing white missionaries, not the Trobriand people, about island customs. Malinowski wanted to try something new, to leave the comfort of the missionaries' veranda behind and live among the Trobriand people 24 hours a day.
Malinowski very much believed that you should get your hands dirty, you should be out in the field, you should be engaged with reality, which was not the way that these gentlemen scholars had written. Basically, it was armchair library work. People would basically do a quick tour and then come back and, after 3 or 4 weeks or months out there, write it up. Malinowski believed you had to be there for at least a whole year to get the full annual cycle, and preferably you should keep going back again and again and again throughout your life.
Malinowski would go to the Trobriands twice between May 1915 and October 1918, staying close to a year each time. While there, he would fill his notebooks with detailed descriptions of local customs, take dozens of photographs, and even make a few primitive recordings of Trobriand songs. But when Malinowski first arrived in the Trobriand Islands, he hardly knew where to begin.
Imagine yourself then making your first entry into the village. Some natives flock round you, especially if they smell tobacco. Others, the more dignified and elderly, remain seated where they are. You, as an ethnographer, will have to approach them.
At first, Malinowski wasn't sure how he should approach the villagers. He didn't know their language, wasn't familiar with their customs, wasn't sure he would be welcomed.
I well remember the long visits I paid to the villages during the first weeks. The feelings of hopelessness and despondency after many obstinate but futile attempts had entirely failed to bring me into real touch with the natives.
Finally, the frustrated Malinowski committed himself to doing something few other anthropologists ever bothered to do: learn the local language.
He says somewhere there's no penetration without language, there's no sort of understanding another culture without language, and that was a sort of hallmark of his later fieldwork in the Trobrians.
Malinowski's interest in other cultures and in learning their languages had started long before he reached the Trobriand Islands. Born in the Polish city of Krakow in 1884, Malinowski had been raised as a multilingual citizen of a multicultural empire.
His parents were intellectuals. His father was a professor of language at the Jagiellonian University, which was the great university in Krakow, which was in Poland, but part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire when Malinowski was growing up. So it was a very mixed Polish and German cultural atmosphere. And Malinowski's father was a specialist in Polish language and Polish folklore and so on.
A childhood illness gave Malinowski a unique chance to develop his own interest in folklore.
Because he was ill and because it was thought to be healthy, he was sent to stay with a peasant family in the Carpathian Mountains for a couple of months. And he always said this was his first exposure to another way of life, another way of thinking, other religious ideas, and other manners, foods, and so on and so forth, even another dialect.
By the time he reached the Trobriand Islands in 1915, Malinowski was already fluent in Polish, German, French, English, and Spanish. Now he dedicated himself to learning the Trobriand language too.
In learning my Trobriand language, I found that I acquired it rather as a child does. I learned a few words and then these began to multiply. I did not use the academic approach. I had to learn to behave like the native in personal and social intercourse. Through this, I learned how they think.
He worked hard at it, he had an ear for languages, and so within about 6 months, he was speaking Trobriand quite fluently.
The more he got into the language, of course, the more things opened up for him, the more customs he was able to uncover of this culture.
But Malinowski soon realized that learning the language was just the first step.
In this type of work, it is good for the ethnographer sometimes to put aside camera, notebook, and pencil, and to join in himself in what is going on. He can take part in the natives' games. He can follow them on their visits and walks, sit down and listen and share in their conversations.
Malinowski was inventing a new way to conduct anthropological fieldwork. It would become known as participant observation.
Participant observation is a very complicated word for a very simple thing. It's anthropologists' sort of primary tool, but all it really means is that you go to a place and you get involved in the culture in every way you possibly can. You go fishing with the men, you go planting with the women, you make a basket. Of course, you make it very bad and everybody laughs at you and so on and so on and so on. That's participant observation too.
In participating, you begin to understand what it takes to do something. The physical effort, the social relations that you need to build up things. You get an intuitive understanding of how to do things in a society.
But Trobriand society often made the urbane Malinowski uncomfortable. In letters home, he wrote of how his dark-skinned and primitive subjects rubbed him the wrong way.
I have been feeling very depressed lately. And as I told you, I began to feel queer about the natives. I simply loathed the village and all of its inhabitants.
Sometimes he's enchanted by what the Trobrians do. He's fascinated by it. Sometimes he just gets terrifically angry. And he's pushed around by people, and they're lying to him. Or they say they're going to meet him here this evening, and they don't turn up, and he gets into a rage.
But neither his own ambivalence nor the seeming reluctance of his subjects would keep Malinowski from pursuing his new approach to fieldwork. And as he participated more and more in Trobriand life, he gained an insight that would change the way anthropologists conduct their research.
As soon as Malinowski introduced this new way of collecting material, he introduced a distinction, which became a crucial distinction, between what people tell you and what people do, or what people say and what they do. Now, it's not because people are necessarily being deliberately misleading, but if I asked you about baseball, you'd give me some of the rules of baseball, maybe a bit of baseball history, maybe you'd tell me about Babe Ruth, maybe you'd tell me how popular it was. But I would get a different picture if I went and I watched a baseball game. And then I'd get a different picture again if I started playing baseball myself at different kinds of levels. So what Malinowski was saying was that to really understand what's going on in baseball, you have to do all those things. You have to talk to people about it, you have to watch it, and you have to go out there and learn a little bit about how to do it yourself. Only then will you really understand what people do, which is different from what they say.
Malinowski realized that anthropologists who relied solely on what people told them had no way of knowing if their data was accurate or not. Participant observation was needed to uncover the truth.
Out of such plunges into the life of the natives, and I made them frequently, I have carried away a distinct feeling that their behavior, their manner of being, in all sorts of tribal transactions, became more transparent and easily understandable than it had been before.
The longer he stayed in the Trobriands, the more he realized what a rich and valuable kind of study he was doing. He had an enormous amount of information in the end on everything from kinship to religion to the sex lives, the family life, to the trading systems, the customs of warfare and fighting.
So you begin to get a richer picture, which is a picture of, Malinowski says, of what's going on. Now this leads then to a further issue, which is why do people do things?
For decades, many anthropologists were most interested in how societies had evolved over time. To these evolutionists, many of the seemingly strange customs they observed seemed to be nothing more than holdovers from the past, irrational practices and beliefs native people clung to out of superstition or habit. They dubbed these pointless practices survivals and viewed them as more useful for understanding the past than the present.
Before Malinowski, people talked about survivals, where apparently crazy things that people did were, well, they'd made sense 300 years before. That's why people were still doing them. Malinowski said, no, they've survived because they're still doing something useful.
When you get to that stage, Malinowski says, when you're watching what people are really doing, you will find that the best explanation of most of what they're doing is that it pays them off. That there is a self-interest which explains what they're doing, and that he called their function.
Each institution fulfills a certain function. For example, magic in primitive society, religion in the Middle Ages, modern Christianity, all satisfy a human craving for the mastery of fate, for the mastery of natural or supernatural forces.
Malinowski's new approach to anthropology would become known as functionalism. This deceptively simple idea would challenge the way European anthropologists viewed the non-European people they studied.
This doesn't seem to be a terrifically revolutionary thought, if I put it in this way. But it was very revolutionary because a lot of people believed 100 years ago, probably still believe now, that while we're rational, most of the rest of the world are pretty irrational. It was based on a notion that these were lesser people than ourselves. We could understand a whole lot of stuff. They didn't really understand it. They didn't really understand what they were caught up in. They didn't understand the world around them. They were doing things that were damaging to them, that were immoral, and so on and so on. They could learn from us to be more efficient human beings.
Functionalism allowed Malinowski to see that these seemingly irrational behaviors were actually rational, at least from the natives' point of view.
Malinowski said, well, They might give explanations which you can't really grasp for what's going on. But if you go and watch them going about their daily lives, you'll begin to see that given their circumstances, they were as rational as anybody else. They weren't philosophers, but they were shrewd people who had a pretty good grasp of what was best for them.
Malinowski found one of his most important examples of the rational function behind a seemingly irrational behavior in the Trobriand custom known as the Kula.
The Kula was the trading expeditions that these people made. They went from island to island exchanging goods. What did they exchange? They exchanged apparently useless goods, arm shells and necklaces. And if I gave you, my Kula partner, an arm shell, you had to give me in exchange a necklace. And my trading partners in another direction I gave necklaces to, and they gave me arm shells. So Malinowski describes the Kula in great detail, and he fills you in on all the aspects of it, how the crews are recruited, what magic they're using to make their boats safer. And people were taking big risks for these trips. Why were they doing it? What was going on here? And he says, here we've got a society, the Trobrians, without policemen, without law courts. How are people punished for antisocial behavior? And he says the punishment is that people break off these exchange relationships with them. So they are excluded more and more from society, sometimes temporarily, sometimes in the longer term. So in Malinowski's later study, exchanges, or the exchange system, is one of the main mechanisms for the control of behavior.
Understanding the functions behind customs like the Kula helped Malinowski to learn an even greater lesson, that he and his fellow Europeans had more in common with the Trobriand people than they had ever imagined.
And so the final conclusion is, people are pretty much the same everywhere. Malinowski talks about the Trobriand islanders as savages, but he talks about himself as a savage as well. He talks about the Viennese businessmen with whom he compares them as savages. So he's being ironic. He's saying, if they're savage, we're savage. If we're civilized, they're civilized, because they are behaving pretty much the same way, driven by pretty much the same motives, but in different circumstances. He says, we can use the same way of thinking about human behavior, whether we're in Warsaw or London or in the Trobriand Islands.
Malinowski left the Trobrians for good in 1918, but the lessons he learned there stayed with him for the rest of his life. In 1922, he began sharing those lessons with the world and revolutionizing anthropology with Argonauts of the Western Pacific. That same year, he joined the faculty of the prestigious London School of Economics.
Malinowski really begins to be seen as a revolutionary figure through his teaching, because the word gets out that there's a new way of doing anthropology. So he becomes the hub of a discipline which is seen now as exciting, seen now as relevant, and which is attracting funds and attracting students all over, all to Malinowski, partly because of his message, partly because of his personality, partly because he seizes the moment.
Through it all, Malinowski's field work in the Trobriand Islands remained central to his message and his growing reputation. In 1929, Malinowski drew on the Trobrians' reputation as the Islands of Love to write one of his most influential and popular books.
Malinowski's great breakthrough to fame comes because he aims a book at the broader general public, which he called The Sexual Life of Savages. And so that really hits the headlines. People go, rush out and buy it.
He was a brilliant self-publicist in that book, The Sexual Life of Savages. I mean, you know, it's a scorching title, isn't it? I remember someone telling me that the Oxford department sent someone to London to buy a copy and bring it back in a brown paper bag.
And if you read it, there's quite a lot of sex in it, but also there's the Malinowskian argument. Hey, you know, even when it comes to sex, they're not that different from us. People have different habits and different customs, but they are not off the map. We can understand what they're doing, we can appreciate what they're doing. We might even want to do what they're doing ourselves. So even that book, in the end, comes back to the argument of common humanity, common rationality, common emotions, common desires, common kinds of quarrels and arguments and tensions and jealousies. They feel more or less the same way as we do about love and about all these kinds of things.
The wide interest in the sexual life of savages helped transform Malinowski into a recognized and respected public figure.
He certainly thought that he was going to be a great man. He was not shy of making statements on big issues. So in the 1930s, as his reputation develops in England, he begins to broadcast on the BBC on all sorts of issues. So he's becoming a general intellectual, popular intellectual.
If he were around today, he would constantly be on our televisions. He'd be on everything from late-night line-up to jukebox jury. He loved the media. He was a skilled self-publicist, and he would have taken to it like a duck to water.
For the next 10 years, Malinowski used the power his newfound fame gave him to reshape British anthropology in his own image.
A senior academic once told me that he'd written an article which was mildly in a disagreement with some of Malinowski's own views, and he sent it to Man, to the Anthropology Journal, to be published. And he got a letter from Malinowski a few weeks later saying, "Saw your article sent to Man. They sent it to me, of course. It's all right, I've rewritten it, it's sound now." And that's the sort of man he was. He had a terribly despotic air about him, and he really did want to control British anthropology. And at the end, I think that was very much to its disadvantage. In Malinowski's sort of anthropology, the native point of view was important and should be listened to, but behind it all, there was the idea that the anthropologist was the man who really understood. He saw beyond what the natives saw. He saw the functions behind all these various institutions. He was more intelligent, he was wiser, he had the Olympian vision. So, if you like, that sort of anthropology nowadays seems to us very arrogant and condescending.
But even those who resented Malinowski's tight grip on British anthropology had to recognize his unique contributions to the field.
Malinowski is certainly one of the great figures in the social sciences in the first half of the 20th century. Within anthropology, he's a towering figure.
By the time of his death in 1942, at the age of 58, Malinowski's place in anthropology's pantheon seemed secure. It looked like nothing could tarnish his reputation as the inventor of participant observation and functionalism, and as a humanitarian who had formed a unique bond with the people of the Trobriand Islands. But with the 1968 publication of the diaries he had kept during his days in the Trobriands, that reputation took a direct hit. Suddenly, Malinowski's frank and often brutal descriptions of his private frustrations with the Trobriand people were in full public view.
And that was really one of the eye-openers of his diary when it was published, that he revealed that, you know, as opposed to his relationship to the Trobriand Islanders in his writings, in his monographs, where he obviously loved them, he adored them, he regarded them with great affection. He looked very fondly on their little foibles. In his diary, sometimes he hated them, sometimes he couldn't stand to be around them.
I see the life of the natives as utterly devoid of interest or importance. Something as remote from me as the life of a dog.
What is seized on are very racist statements that he makes from time to time, apparently racist statements about the Trobrians.
I am glad that the Obaraku niggers are behind me, and that I'll never again live in this village.
Readers of the diaries debated whether Malinowski's seemingly casual use of a word that shocks us today was merely a byproduct of the racial attitudes of his time, or revealed a deep-seated racism he expressed in his private diaries but kept out of his published works. Either way, anthropology's god professor seemed to have been knocked off his pedestal.
Students were horrified by this exposure of the weaknesses of the man. And he was obviously seen to have feet of clay and to be not a very nice person at all, by his own admission. But other students said, no, hang on, look, we're learning a lot here that needs to be known about how anthropology is done, how you can feel unhappy during your fieldwork. It's not a matter of instant rapport with all the natives who you get on with as friends. You have these moments of terrible depression. And you're really half the time, you're not living in that situation, you want to be somewhere else. You think of your girlfriend, your wife at home. You're missing people. You're feeling sad, desperate. You're feeling sexually frustrated. Malinowski expressed all these things in his diaries. And there's a drama in it. There's a sort of psychological Freudian drama.
So when you read the diaries now, after the fuss has died down, they're a very living record of a very human person, very intelligent, very cultured, very sophisticated, living in a very difficult moment in his life. And I think that as a professional reading it, what really impresses me is how hard he worked, how thoroughly, systematically hard he worked. And you've got it there in the diary, day by day, against great odds.
In the end, Malinowski's achievements seemed to matter more than the diaries and their shocking revelations.
People are often critical of Malinowski, and I have been too. But at the time, he was a tremendous positive force in British anthropology and represented a huge advance over the subject as it was then.
It's interesting to reflect on Malinowski's legacy because more and more people go back to Malinowski as an exemplar, a way of finding out what's really going on in another society. And so I would say Malinowski has become, a generation after his death, the great example of what a social anthropologist is doing, should be doing.